So, what happens when a superpower just decides the rules don't really apply to them anymore? Well, we might be about to find out. We're going to dive into a military operation that didn't just take out a world leader, it also resurrected a 200-year-old foreign policy and gave it a very controversial new name. The date is January 3rd, 2026. It's the pre-dawn hours in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. And the city's quiet is about to be completely shattered by an event that would send shockwaves all around the world. The mission was called Operation Absolute Resolve, and it was exactly what it sounds like. U.S. Special Forces launched this incredibly bold, surprise military operation with one single high-stakes goal: to capture a sitting president. Now, this wasn't some covert mission to help out the local opposition. No, this was a direct, you could even call it a smash-and-grab raid, right on sovereign soil. And it was all over in a flash. It was incredibly swift and decisive. Before the sun even came up, elite units, we're talking Delta Force and the 160th Special Ops Aviation Regiment, they hit their targets hard. President Maduro and the First Lady Celia Flores were captured. The aftermath, though, was bloody, with reports saying at least 80 people were killed. And the final destination? Get this, not a neutral third country, not a negotiation table, but a federal detention center in Brooklyn, New York. So you have to ask yourself, how could the Trump administration possibly justify a move like this? I mean, an action this dramatic needed an equally dramatic explanation, and what they came up with was this mix of legal charges and a really bold reimagining of American foreign policy itself. The official story had a few different layers. First, it was framed as a counter-narcotics op. President Maduro was already under indictment in the U.S. for narco-terrorism, which is basically the accusation that he was using the drug trade to fund hostile activities. The White House also claimed that Venezuela was an imminent threat, saying they were working with groups like Hezbollah to move drugs and weapons into the U.S. And this is where things take a really historic turn. President Trump himself completely reframed a 200-year-old policy. In his own words, he took the famous Monroe Doctrine, said it was superseded, and then rebranded it with his own name, the Donro Document. So this wasn't just about a single raid, it was the announcement of a whole new ballgame.
This new corollary, or this addition, is really the heart of the whole justification. It states very clearly that the United States has the right to use unilateral military force, unilateral meaning by itself, without asking anyone, against any adversary in the region. And the stated goal? To restore American preeminence in its own hemisphere. It's a very assertive, very clear statement of intent.
But here's the thing. The Donro Doctrine didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's actually the latest, and you could argue the most aggressive evolution, of a policy that has been shaping the entire continent for 200 years.
It all started way back in 1823. The original Monroe Doctrine was basically a clear message from the U.S. to the old European empires: stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It basically drew a line in the sand, saying the Americas were a U.S. sphere of influence, and in return, the U.S. would stay out of Europe's business. And you can see the evolution so clearly right here. In 1823, it was a warning: hey, don't come over here. Then by 1904, you get Teddy Roosevelt's Corollary, which changed it to, you know what, we actually have the right to intervene to keep you out. And now, in 2026, the Donro Doctrine takes it to the final step, which is basically, we will use direct military force to remove any government that we see as a threat.
So, as you can probably imagine, the reaction to all of this was immediate, and it was deeply divided. I mean, the raid on Caracas instantly split opinion, not just inside the United States, but across the entire global community. What's really interesting is that even inside the U.S., there was some pretty significant opposition from all over the political map. You had Democratic leaders like Hakeem Jeffries calling it an unconstitutional act of war. But what's really surprising is that some Republicans, folks like Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they also slammed it. They saw it as going back to that old Washington playbook of regime change that they felt didn't really serve American interests.
The United Nations, for its part, was deeply alarmed. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he pointed out that international law just seemed to have been completely ignored, setting what he called a dangerous precedent. But here's the thing. With the U.S. holding veto power on the Security Council, the UN was pretty much powerless to do anything about it.
And Venezuela's closest neighbors? They were pretty much united in their condemnation. You had major Latin American powers, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, all coming together in a joint statement. They called the raid a clear violation of sovereignty. And there's that phrase again. They also called it a dangerous precedent and an act of aggression.
The pushback from other major world powers was just as swift and just as severe. China slammed what it called hegemonic acts. Russia didn't mince words, labeling the strikes armed aggression. Iran and South Africa both called it a flagrant violation of international law and a direct attack on the principles of the UN Charter itself.
India, meanwhile, found itself in a really tricky position. As a leader of the Global South and the chair of BRICS, there was a lot of pressure to condemn the action. But at the same time, it had to manage its strategic relationship with the US. So the result was this very carefully worded statement expressing deep concern, but without actually naming or blaming Washington. A real diplomatic tightrope.
Okay, so, with the world split and tensions running high, what's the big takeaway? Why does one event like this matter so much? Well, the raid on Caracas isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the very rules that are supposed to govern how countries deal with each other.
And this really gets to the core of the concern here. The worry is that this signals a big shift away from an international system based on rules and laws, and towards one where, as this analyst put it, naked power is the only thing that really matters. And that kind of world, well, it just breeds mistrust and dramatically raises the risk of future conflict. The long-term effects could seriously reshape global politics for decades to come. I mean, we could be seeing a return to a world that's just carved up into spheres of influence. An action like this could embolden other powers, say Russia or China, to do something similar in their own backyards, thinking that international law is no longer a real constraint. It weakens institutions like the UN and sends a pretty chilling message that maybe the rules only apply to the less powerful states. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. The Donro Doctrine asserts that, for one powerful nation, its own interests are more important than the rules. And if that becomes the new normal, if might is right truly becomes the guiding principle of our world, then you really have to ask yourself, what comes next?